The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the second hand of the antique wall clock carving up the afternoon moment by moment. The people gathered in the gallery that day were expecting a standard bitter divorce, nothing more. Not a single soul sitting on those hard wooden benches had the slightest idea that within a matter of minutes they were going to witness something that would permanently rewrite the history of several families. A man in a bespoke charcoal suit sat at the plaintiff's table. He wore the comfortable arrogance of a man who was entirely used to getting whatever he wanted. His name was Arthur Vance. He was a highly successful real estate developer, a titan in the local business circles, and a man with an absolutely flawless reputation. At least that was the story everyone bought. Directly across from him sat his wife, Eleanor. She looked remarkably calm. If you looked closely, you could see the shadows of sleepless nights, the weight of months of quiet humiliation, and the bruises of painful memories. But her face held nothing but pure dignity. She didn't cry. She didn't put on a performance to fish for pity. She just sat perfectly straight, her eyes fixed forward. And this drove Arthur absolutely insane. For the last few months, he had made it his personal mission to break her down to the studs. He had frozen her out of their joint bank accounts. He had poisoned the well with their mutual friends, systematically feeding them whispers about her supposed infidelities. He had turned her life into a ghost town. But Eleanor simply refused to shatter, and that quiet defiance was the one thing he couldn't stand. The heavy wooden doors opened. The judge walked in, and the bailiff called the room to rise. He was a tall, silver-haired man in his late 60s, carrying a gaze that was severe but undeniably just. He took a seat at the bench. "You may be seated." His voice was steady, anchored in absolute authority. The judge briefly scanned the mountain of legal documents arranged before him. Eleanor looked up. For a fraction of a second, her eyes met the judge's. Something flickered in her expression, a sharp, almost imperceptible flash of pain. No one in the gallery caught it, but the judge did. The hearing began. Arthur's attorney, a slick man with a rehearsed cadence, laid out his client's position. He spun a tale of a marriage that had been dead for years, ruined by Eleanor's constant erratic conflicts. He argued that the lion's share of the assets naturally belonged to Arthur, as he was the sole provider. Every word was polished. Every sentence was a calculated strike. Eleanor just listened, letting the silence stretch. When it was finally her turn to speak, she stood up slowly. "Your Honor, I am not asking for a single penny more than what the law requires. I am only asking for the truth." Her voice trembled exactly once, then hardened into steel. "Everything my husband has just claimed is a lie." Arthur let out a low, mocking smirk. The judge caught that smirk, and his eyes narrowed. "Do you have evidence to support this?" the judge asked. Eleanor nodded. "I do." She handed a thick manila folder to her attorney, who walked it up to the bench. Arthur's posture stiffened just a fraction, but he quickly smoothed his features back into that mask of untouchable confidence. He controlled the board. He always controlled the board. The judge opened the folder and began to read. With every page he turned, the temperature in the room seemed to drop. The lines on his face deepened into a dark, stony grimace. The folder was a goldmine of hidden truths, bank statements from offshore accounts, intercepted text messages, photographs, signed affidavits from Arthur's own corporate employees. These papers didn't tell the story of a broken marriage. They told a horror story. A story of massive financial fraud, of calculated psychological warfare, of a predator who had spent years hiding his true face from the world. For the very first time, a cold spike of genuine panic pierced Arthur's chest. He leaned forward and glared at Eleanor. "You're actually going to try and use this?" he hissed. She didn't even blink. She just looked at him, and her silence was louder than a gunshot. The judge slowly raised his head. "Mr. Vance, I have a few questions regarding the contents of this file." "Of course, Your Honor," Arthur replied, though the velvet smoothness was completely gone from his voice. The questions came down like hammer blows. They grew increasingly specific, increasingly dangerous. Arthur's answers grew thin, defensive, and desperate. You could feel the atmosphere in the room shifting on its axis. People in the gallery started exchanging wide-eyed looks. Even the reporters sitting in the back row stopped chewing their pens. They all felt the electric charge in the air. This was no longer a divorce. It was a demolition. Arthur felt the walls closing in, and his panic began to curdle into blind, white-hot rage. When Eleanor's attorney introduced an audio transcript where Arthur explicitly threatened to leave his wife destitute in the streets, the developer snapped. He violently shoved his chair back and jumped to his feet. "It's a fabrication." His voice echoed off the high ceilings, raw and desperate. "Order in this court," the judge warned, his tone dropping to a dangerous chill. But Arthur was too far gone. A lifetime of wealth, power, and absolute immunity had poisoned his brain. He was a man who had never been told no, and right now, his entire empire was burning to ash in front of a live audience. "She set this whole thing up," he screamed, pointing a shaking finger at his wife. Eleanor rose from her chair, her movements calm and deliberate. "No, Arthur. It's just the truth." Those words were the match in the powder barrel. In the next fraction of a second, the unthinkable happened. Arthur closed the distance between them with 2 rapid steps, raised his hand, and struck his wife across the face with everything he had. The crack of the slap sounded like a whip cracking in a canyon. Someone in the gallery screamed. 3 people jumped out of their seats. Eleanor stumbled backward, catching herself on the edge of the table, refusing to fall. A furious, bright red mark instantly bloomed across her cheek. For 3 agonizing seconds, the entire courtroom stopped breathing. Time just froze. The bailiffs snapped out of their shock and began sprinting toward Arthur. The reporters in the back were frantically clawing for their phones. Arthur stood there, his chest heaving, staring at his own hand, as the horrific reality of what he had just done in a court of law finally washed over him. And that is when the judge spoke. But the voice that boomed through the room didn't belong to a man presiding over a legal dispute. It was the voice of a father who had stayed quiet for far too long. "That is enough." Everyone froze. The judge rose slowly from his heavy leather chair. The color had completely drained from his face. His hands were gripping the edge of the bench so hard his knuckles were white. He locked eyes with Arthur, and the sheer, unadulterated fury in that gaze was so terrifying that even the charging bailiffs stopped dead in their tracks. Nobody in the room understood why this famously stoic, impenetrable man looked ready to commit murder. Nobody except Eleanor. Tears finally spilled over her eyelashes and tracked down her face, stinging the welt on her cheek. She knew the secret she had buried for years, the secret her husband had never in all their time together even suspected, a secret that was about to turn his life into a crater. The judge took a step back from the bench, looking down at the man who had just struck his child. "You really don't know who she is, do you?" The silence in the room was suffocating. Arthur whipped his head back and forth between the judge and Eleanor, his mind struggling to process the words. "What are you talking about?" he demanded, trying to scrape together some shred of his old bravado. The judge looked right through him. I mean that for all these years, you have been so entirely consumed by your own ego, you never once stopped to ask yourself why the woman you were torturing never bothered to ask for help. The bailiffs were flanking Arthur now, hands hovering near their belts, ready to take him to the ground if he even twitched. But Arthur didn't care. His entire universe had narrowed down to the man in the black robe. Eleanor lowered her head. She always knew this collision was coming. She just never imagined it would happen like this. The judge slowly took off his reading glasses. Eleanor is my daughter. An invisible bomb detonated in the gallery. A collective gasp sucked all the oxygen out of the room. Pens furiously scratched across notepads. People half stood from their benches, craning their necks. Arthur turned to stone. His face contorted into a mask of total blank incomprehension. He looked like a man who had just been told the sky was made of glass. "She is my daughter," the judge repeated, his voice echoing in the absolute quiet. "My only child." Eleanor closed her eyes. The truth was finally out in the open air. Arthur spun around to face her, his eyes wild. "This is a joke." She slowly shook her head. "No. Why didn't you ever tell me?" His voice cracked. A bitter, exhausted smile touched the corners of her mouth. "Because I wanted to be loved for who I am, not for my last name." That sentence hit Arthur harder than a freight train. A floodlight suddenly illuminated the dark corners of his memory. He remembered the day they met. She was a quiet girl working at a local library. He remembered her tiny, run-down apartment, her simple clothes, the complete lack of jewelry or designer labels. It all looked so different now. The horrible realization washed over him that he had never actually cared about her past. He thought he knew her, but he only knew the version of her he had invented in his own head. "This is impossible," he muttered, stumbling back a step. The judge opened the manila folder again, staring down at the papers, though he wasn't really reading them. "When Eleanor was 20 years old, we had a terrible falling out." The raw pain in the old man's voice was impossible to fake. "She decided to make her own way in the world. She refused to use my name, my money, or my influence." Eleanor looked away, staring at the wood grain of the plaintiff's table. Every word her father spoke pulled her back into a past she had tried to lock away. "We barely spoke for years," the judge continued, his eyes locked on Arthur. "But I never stopped watching over her. I always knew where she was." Not a single chair squeaked in the gallery. "When she married you, I was dead set against it." A sickening, icy dread began to pool in Arthur's stomach. "Why?" The judge leaned forward, his eyes boring into Arthur's soul. "Because the very first time I looked at you, I saw exactly what she refused to see." It sounded like a death sentence. Eleanor flinched. She remembered that screaming match with her father. She remembered defending Arthur, begging her dad to see the good in him, convinced that the man she loved was a good person. She had believed in him so blindly, and she had been so incredibly wrong. "I thought you were just being unfair to him," she whispered. The judge nodded slowly. "I know, sweetheart." For a long moment, the courtroom fell away. They weren't a judge and a plaintiff. They weren't strangers bound by legal procedure. They were just a father and a daughter, looking at each other across a chasm of wasted years. Arthur felt the floorboards rotting beneath his feet. The game was over, and he was losing his mind. "So this whole thing was a setup?" he snarled, pointing between the two of them. "No," Eleanor said softly. "You both just decided to team up and destroy me in public." The judge shook his head, his expression turning to pure ice. "You are doing a fine job of destroying yourself, Mr. Vance." "It's easy for you to say," Arthur shouted, his face turning purple. "You're the one sitting up there with all the power." For the first time that day, the judge raised his voice to a roar. Power. The word cracked like thunder, making half the room physically jump. You have the nerve to stand there and talk to me about power 60 seconds after you assaulted a woman in a federal courtroom. Arthur's jaw snapped shut. He had no answer. He couldn't spin this. Hundreds of eyes had seen it. The court cameras had recorded it. The reality of his situation was finally sinking its teeth into his bones. But the most terrifying part wasn't the judge. It was Eleanor. When Arthur looked at his wife, she didn't look afraid anymore. For the first time in years, she looked completely, wonderfully free. It was as if heavy iron chains had just dropped from her shoulders to the floor. The judge slowly sat back down. The air in the room had fundamentally changed. Everyone sitting in that gallery knew they were no longer watching a divorce trial. They were watching an execution. The court clerk stepped up to the bench and handed the judge a single sheet of paper. He read the few lines printed on it, and the hard lines of his face grew even darker. "Well, isn't this interesting?" the judge murmured. Arthur's stomach plummeted into a bottomless pit. "What else?" The judge held up the paper. "It appears the file on my desk is missing a few chapters." Eleanor's attorney stood up and buttoned his suit jacket. "We received a secondary cache of evidence early this morning, Your Honor." "What kind of evidence?" Arthur demanded, his voice cracking. The attorney reached down, clicked open a massive leather briefcase, and pulled out an accordion file so thick and heavy it made a dull thud when he dropped it on the table. The reporters in the back leaned forward like wolves smelling blood. "Your Honor, these documents contain a comprehensive audit of several offshore shell corporations directly tied to Mr. Vance." Arthur went dead pale. It was a subtle shift in color, but it was enough. The judge saw it, Eleanor saw it. The press corps definitely saw it. "Bring them here," the judge commanded. The massive file was passed up to the bench. The judge opened it. He read the first page, then the second, then the third. With every flip of a page, the invisible noose around Arthur's neck pulled a little tighter. He no longer looked like the untouchable titan of industry. He looked like a man standing on train tracks, watching the headlights of an oncoming freight train. "Where did you get that?" Arthur croaked, his throat completely dry. Eleanor's attorney didn't answer him. He just turned and looked toward the heavy double doors at the back of the courtroom. Right on cue, the brass handles turned. The doors swung open with a slow, heavy groan. Everyone turned to look. 3 men stepped over the threshold. They were dressed in sharp, dark suits, moving with the synchronized, quiet confidence of apex predators. They didn't look like tourists who had wandered into the wrong room. They looked like the federal government. The judge looked at the men walking down the center aisle, then looked back down at the financial records in front of him. Arthur watched the judge's face, and what he saw there made his blood run cold. It was the look of a man having his worst, darkest suspicions confirmed in black and white. Arthur's heart began to hammer violently against his ribs. He recognized the man walking in the center, and he knew with absolute certainty that this particular man did not leave his office unless the sky was falling. He also knew that if this man was here today, the secrets buried in that accordion file were 1,000 times more lethal than anything Eleanor had brought to light so far. The man in the center stopped at the wooden gate, reached into his breast pocket and flipped open a leather badge wallet. And for the very first time in his adult life, Arthur Vance felt the cold, paralyzing grip of true terror. Fear was an alien concept to Arthur. For a decade, he had lived by the golden rule: money unlocks the doors, connections bury the bodies, and influence buys the silence. But the rules had just changed. The man with the badge walked up to the clerk, handed over his credentials, and waited while they were passed up to the judge. The judge scrutinized the ID, then looked down at the man. "State your name and authority for the record." The man nodded. "Special agent in charge of the Financial Crimes Division." A frantic, hissing whisper swept through the gallery. Cell phones were flying out of pockets in the press row. The divorce was officially dead. This was a federal takedown. Arthur felt a block of ice slide down his spine. The special agent turned to him. Their eyes met. "Mr. Vance," just 2 words. But the way the agent said them carried the weight of a 3-year, wiretap-heavy federal investigation. "We've been looking forward to having a chat with you." Arthur forced his mouth into a sick, crooked smile. "Then call my attorney and schedule a sit-down." A few people in the gallery let out nervous, barking laughs. But the special agent didn't even crack a smile. "I'm afraid we're a little past the scheduling phase, Arthur." The judge was flipping through the thick stack of financial records. Eleanor sat perfectly still, watching the nightmare unfold. She felt like she was floating underwater. When she woke up this morning, she had been bracing herself for a brutal slugfest. She expected character assassination. She expected to be humiliated. But the dominoes were falling so fast, she could barely track the carnage. Arthur caught her staring at him, and a hot flash of paranoid rage overtook his fear. "You knew about this," he hissed at her. She took a moment before answering. "About what, exactly?" "Don't play dumb with me." "No," she said softly. And it was the absolute truth. She had no idea what was in the second folder on the judge's desk. The special agent stepped forward. "Your Honor, in light of recent developments, we are formally requesting to submit additional federal evidence into the court record." "Granted," the judge said. Another thick folder was dropped onto the pile. The mountain of paper was growing to absurd proportions. Arthur's mouth tasted like copper. A memory from 3 months ago suddenly flashed in his mind. His CFO had walked into his office sweating, talking about strange inquiries from the IRS, weird delays at the banks, and men in cheap suits asking questions around their job sites. Arthur had laughed him out of the room. He thought he was untouchable. He was a fool. The judge opened the federal file. He read the top sheet, then the next. Finally, he looked up, peering over his glasses. "Mr. Vance." The judge's voice was completely stripped of emotion. That flat, clinical tone terrified Arthur more than the shouting. "Yes." "Are you familiar with a corporate entity operating under the name Apex Horizon Builders?" Arthur froze. It was only for a fraction of a second, but it was enough. The judge saw it, the special agent saw it, and Eleanor saw it. "Of course," Arthur lied smoothly. "And you maintain under oath that you have no direct financial ties to this entity." "I do not." The special agent pulled a single sheet of paper from his own jacket pocket. "That's fascinating." He laid the paper flat on the defense table. "Because, according to the Cayman Island registry we just cracked, you are the sole controlling beneficiary of that corporation." A low roar of shocked murmurs rolled through the courtroom. Arthur sprang out of his chair. "That is a complete fabrication. Then I'm sure your legal team will have an easy time proving us wrong," the agent replied. His voice was casual, almost bored. It was the tone of a man playing chess who had already seen checkmate 15 moves ago. The judge kept turning pages. With every passing second, the shadows on his face grew darker. Eleanor watched the tiny details. The tight set of her father's jaw. The white-knuckle grip he had on his pen. This wasn't just tax fraud. He was reading something monstrous. These documents detail the systematic laundering of tens of millions of dollars through ghost companies, the judge stated, speaking to the room at large. Nobody dared interrupt him. There are also extensive records of phantom municipal contracts and severe tax evasion. Arthur felt the floor drop out from under him. He knew exactly what this meant. Someone had flipped. Someone deep inside his inner circle had taken a plea deal and given the feds the keys to the castle. Every face he knew flashed behind his eyes. His partners, his lawyers, his fixers. There were too many suspects. The special agent seemed to read his mind. The thing about building an empire on fear, Arthur, is that eventually people get really tired of being afraid. The words were spoken quietly, but they hit Arthur like a sniper round. He gripped the edge of the table. "You can't prove a damn thing." "Maybe," the agent shrugged. "Or maybe we're about to prove a lot more than you bargained for." Right on cue, the heavy courtroom doors swung open again. Everyone whipped their heads around. A woman in her early 40s walked down the aisle. She wore a sharp-tailored business suit and clutched a leather portfolio to her chest. When Arthur saw her face, the last drop of blood drained from his cheeks. Eleanor had never, not once in their entire marriage, seen her husband look like a terrified child. The woman stopped right next to the special agent. "Apologies for the delay." "You're right on time," the agent said. The judge peered down at the newcomer. "State your name for the record." "Irene Sterling." At the sound of her name, Arthur physically recoiled, tearing his eyes away from her. That single, guilty flinch was all the special agent needed to see. He gave a tiny, satisfied nod. "Miss Sterling has served as the primary financial advisor for several of the holding companies tied to Mr. Vance," the agent explained. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the air conditioning humming in the vents. Irene looked at Arthur. There was no hatred in her eyes, no fear, and absolutely no pity. Just exhaustion. 7 years, she said, her voice echoing in the stillness. Arthur's jaw worked, but no sound came out. 7 years I sat in that office, she continued. 7 years I signed the blind trusts and the offshore transfers you put in front of me. The tension in the room ratcheted up with every syllable. And the whole time, I told myself it was just business. I told myself it was safer not to ask questions. Eleanor watched the woman closely. She recognized the look in Irene's eyes. It was the hollow, bone-deep fatigue of a person who had been carrying a toxic secret for entirely too long. "But then I heard something," Irene said. The special agent turned to her. "Tell the court what you heard." Irene shifted her gaze to Eleanor. "I was working late. I overheard Mr. Vance talking on the phone. He was talking about you, Mrs. Vance." Arthur's hands curled into tight fists. "Shut your mouth," he hissed. She ignored him. "He told the person on the phone that if things ever got complicated, he would completely destroy you." Nobody in the gallery even blinked. "Because she knew too much?" the judge asked. "That is wildly out of context," Arthur shouted, panic making his voice crack. "No," Irene said, her voice steady and cold. "It's exactly the context." The judge leaned forward, his hands steepled. Eleanor felt a block of ice form in her chest. She was suddenly realizing just how many people had known the truth about her life. How many people had stood quietly in the shadows, watching her husband slowly tear her apart. Irene unzipped her leather portfolio. She pulled out a small black USB flash drive. It was just a cheap piece of plastic, but the look of pure, unadulterated horror that twisted Arthur's face made it look like a live hand grenade. The special agent took the drive from her hand. The judge saw Arthur's reaction and raised an eyebrow. "What is on that drive?" Irene took a slow, deep breath, squared her shoulders, and looked Arthur dead in the eyes. For the first time, a fierce, unbreakable resolve settled over her face. The kind of resolve a person only finds when they decide they are never going to be a victim again. It contains an audio recording of a conversation Mr. Vance firmly believed was deleted. When those words dropped into the dead silence of the courtroom, Arthur realized something worse than the fraud was about to come to light. A secret so dark, Even Eleanor didn't know it existed. For a few merciful seconds, a loud, rushing static filled Arthur's ears, drowning out the room. It was the sound of his own blood pressure spiking. A recording. She had a recording. Out of all the cooked ledgers, the wire fraud, the burner phones, that single word was the one that finally broke him. Because you can hire a team of lawyers to muddy the waters on a bank transfer. You can pay private investigators to dig up dirt and ruin a witness's credibility. You can blame tax evasion on an incompetent accountant, but a voice. You can't fake a man's voice, especially when that voice is saying things that were never, ever supposed to survive the night. The judge stared down at the black plastic drive. When was this recording made? Almost 2 years ago, Irene answered. And why exactly did you sit on it for 2 years? Irene stood in silence for a moment, gathering her courage. When she spoke, the raw honesty in her voice was impossible to doubt. Because I was terrified. At first, I was just scared of losing a high-paying career. She looked at Arthur. But eventually, I became terrified of Mr. Vance himself. Eleanor's breath hitched in her throat. Those words hit her right in the chest. She knew that exact suffocating fear. She had lived in that exact same prison, letting the terror slowly become the wallpaper of her daily life, until she didn't even notice it anymore. The special agent walked over to the clerk's desk and plugged the flash drive into the court's laptop. The entire room leaned forward. The reporters were practically vibrating with anticipation. The silence was agonizing. Arthur suddenly slammed his hands on the table and stood up. I object to this entire circus. On what legal grounds? The judge asked, his voice dripping with venom. This has absolutely nothing to do with a divorce settlement. The special agent let out a dry, humorless laugh. He tapped the keyboard. Maybe not. But it has everything to do with establishing the character and criminal liability of a man who just physically assaulted his wife in front of a federal judge. Arthur had no counter to that. He looked around. 50 people were staring at him. He was drowning in witnesses. Slowly, mechanically, he sank back into his chair. The king of the city had just been reduced to a man waiting for the guillotine to drop. The judge waved a hand. Play the file. The agent double-clicked the icon. A harsh hiss of static hissed through the courtroom speakers. Then the muffled sound of a door closing. And then the voices started. At first, they were slightly muffled, but within seconds, the audio cleared up perfectly, and everyone in the room heard Arthur Vance. His recorded voice was smooth, cocky, and dripping with an arrogant calm. It was the voice of a man who thought he was the smartest person in the room. She doesn't suspect a damn thing. Eleanor froze. She knew that tone. It was the exact voice he used when he was closing a ruthless business deal, talking about people he considered to be nothing more than stepping stones. A woman's voice answered on the tape, Irene. What if she finds out? A low, cruel chuckle echoed through the speakers. She won't. Are you absolutely sure? A brief pause on the tape. And then came the sentence that turned Eleanor's blood to ice water. Even if she does figure it out, nobody is going to believe her. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the traffic out on the street. The recorded voice sounded louder, harsher now. She's too soft. She's gullible. People like her are put on this earth to be used by people like me. Eleanor pressed her hand against her chest, feeling her heart physically ache. It wasn't because the information was new. She knew he was a monster. It was because she was finally hearing it said out loud. No gaslighting, no fake apologies, no flowers the next morning. Just pure, unadulterated malice. The judge sat like a statue carved from granite, but you could see the tendons in his neck straining as he fought the urge to leap over the bench and strangle the man sitting below him. On the tape, Irene spoke again. What if she just packs up and leaves? Arthur's answer was instant. She's not going anywhere. The absolute certainty in his voice was sickening. Why asterisk? Because I built the cage perfectly. The special agent crossed his arms, his eyes locked on Arthur. The judge leaned closer to the speakers. What does that mean? Irene asked on the tape. Another cold, arrogant laugh. And then Arthur Vance delivered a monologue that made several reporters in the back row stop typing and stare in pure horror. You don't break a person all at once. If you do that, they fight back. You have to boil the frog. You do it slowly, day by day, inch by inch. First, you take away her confidence. Then you isolate her from her friends. Then you take control of the money. By the time you're done, she's so twisted around she doesn't even trust her own shadow. She thinks she needs you just to breathe. Eleanor closed her eyes, tears leaking through her lashes. It was a perfect surgical description of the last 5 years of her life. He had convinced her not to go to dinner with her girlfriends. He had told her she wasn't smart enough to handle the household finances. He had constantly corrected her memory of events until she honestly believed she was losing her mind. A long silence stretched out on the recording. Finally, Irene's voice came back, barely a whisper. That's incredibly cruel. Arthur didn't miss a beat. It's incredibly effective. A woman in the second row of the gallery put a hand over her mouth. A man next to her shook his head in disgust. Arthur just stared straight ahead, his eyes completely hollow. He knew the avalanche had already started, and there was no running from it. But the recording wasn't over, and it was about to get infinitely worse. What if her father gets involved? Irene asked. The question came out of nowhere. Eleanor's head snapped up. The judge stiffened in his chair. On the tape, Arthur let out a loud, genuine bark of laughter. What father? The old man hasn't spoken to her in years. He wrote her off. The judge looked down at his hands. For the first time all day, the mask of absolute authority slipped, revealing the deep, agonizing regret of a father who knew he had let his pride cost him years with his daughter. Arthur was a monster, but on that specific point, he had been right. Even if the old man suddenly decides to play hero, it won't matter. He'll be too late. Arthur continued on the tape. Why asterisk? A heavy, deliberate pause hung in the recorded audio. It was the sound of a man deciding whether or not to cross a line he could never uncross. Finally, he spoke, because by the time he realizes what's happening, every single asset she thinks she owns will be liquidated and buried under 3 layers of offshore shell companies. The special agent immediately looked up at the judge. The judge looked at the mountain of financial documents, then slowly dragged his eyes over to Arthur. Keep it playing, the judge ordered, his voice like grinding stones. For the next 3 minutes, the courtroom listened to a masterclass in financial ruin. Arthur rattled off account numbers, offshore holding companies, wire transfer protocols, and the names of corrupt banking officials. Most of the people in the gallery didn't understand the jargon, but the special agent understood every single syllable. And with every name Arthur dropped, the agent's smile grew a little sharper. Finally, the audio file ended. A heavy, suffocating silence reclaimed the room. Nobody moved. Nobody wanted to be the first to break the spell. The sheer scale of the malice they had just witnessed had completely changed the gravity in the room. But the nightmare wasn't over. The special agent leaned over the laptop and clicked on a second file. It was a tiny audio clip, less than 40 seconds long. The agent frowned at the screen. That's strange, he muttered. Irene turned to him. What is it? There's a second track hidden in the root folder. Arthur's head snapped up. All the color that had managed to return to his face vanished instantly. He looked like a corpse. It was such a violent physical reaction that half the courtroom noticed it. The special agent checked the metadata on the file, then slowly looked up at Arthur. For the first time since he walked through the doors, the federal agent looked genuinely shocked. "Well, I'll be damned." The judge leaned over the bench. "What is it, agent?" The special agent let the silence stretch for 3 agonizing seconds before delivering the kill shot. "Your Honor, if the timestamp on this hidden file is accurate, this conversation took place exactly 3 days after the tragic, unsolved hit-and-run death of a man who used to be Mr. Vance's business partner." Before Arthur's attorney could even open his mouth to object, the special agent slammed his finger down on the spacebar. Audio crackled through the speakers. This recording was different. It was messy, muffled, full of background noise. It sounded like a phone left running inside a jacket pocket by a man who had no idea he was recording his own death warrant. For the first few seconds, there was just the sound of heavy footsteps on concrete, followed by the squeal of a heavy metal door closing. Then a voice. It wasn't Arthur's. It was a man breathing hard, his voice pitched high with absolute panic. "We need to talk right now." The agent cranked the volume to maximum. Everyone in the room leaned forward, holding their breath. Then came Arthur's voice. "It's a little late in the day for a chat." The icy, dead-eyed calm in his tone made the hair on Eleanor's arm stand up. She knew that specific voice. That was the voice Arthur used when he held all the cards and was about to ruin someone's life just for the sport of it. The panicked man spoke again. "This whole thing is completely out of control." A brief pause. "You swore to me nobody was going to get hurt." Arthur's heart was trying to hammer its way out of his rib cage. He remembered this parking garage. He remembered the smell of the damp concrete. He remembered every single word of this conversation, and he knew that if the feds had the whole tape, he was going to die in a federal penitentiary. The special agent was watching Arthur's face like a hawk. The judge was doing the same. They were cataloging every micro-expression, every twitch of his jaw, every drop of sweat forming on his brow. Arthur's recorded voice floated through the room. "Take a breath and calm down." "How the hell am I supposed to calm down?" The man was practically sobbing. "Andrew is dead." Those 3 words hit the courtroom like a physical shockwave. A collective gasp went up. The press row erupted into a frenzy of scribbling pens and tapping screens. The special agent narrowed his eyes. The name was very familiar to him. "Andrew brought it on himself," Arthur replied on the tape, his voice completely devoid of human emotion. Eleanor felt a cold shiver rip down her spine. He sounded like he was discussing a broken printer, not a human being whose life had just been snuffed out. "Do you hear yourself?" the panicked man cried. "He was our friend." A long, agonizing silence stretched across the audio track. And then Arthur let out a short, terrifying little laugh. Friendship ends exactly where the first $1 million begins. Up on the bench, the judge slowly leaned back in his heavy leather chair. His face was a mask of pure stone, but his eyes were burning with a righteous, lethal fire. The tape kept rolling. "What if the cops find the ledgers?" the panicked man asked. "They won't," Arthur said smoothly. "But if they do, they'll find exactly who to blame." The panicked man went dead silent, his brain struggling to process the threat. What does that mean?" Arthur's response was slow, lazy, and utterly terrifying. "It means somebody always has to take the fall for a mistake." The courtroom was so silent you could hear the blood rushing in your own ears. Eleanor noticed a reporter in the second row slowly lower her pen to the paper, staring blankly ahead, too stunned to even take notes. The special agent didn't blink, his eyes locked on the laptop screen. Everyone in the room could feel the climax rushing toward them. The panicked man spoke one last time. His voice had changed. The frantic energy was gone, replaced by a hollow, paralyzing dread. "You're going to pin his murder on me, aren't you?" A long, heavy pause. Then Arthur spoke. His voice dropped to a quiet, deadly whisper. "That depends entirely on how well you keep your mouth shut." Several people in the gallery physically shuddered. It wasn't an implied threat. It was a promise of violence, delivered with the casual ease of a man ordering a cup of coffee. Footsteps echoed on the tape, the scrape of a shoe on concrete. Finally, the panicked man whispered, "I think I'm starting to become very afraid of you." Arthur replied instantly, "That is a very smart decision." The audio cut out. The silence that rushed in to fill the room was thick, heavy, and absolutely suffocating. Nobody moved. Nobody coughed. Even the hardened court reporters were paralyzed. They had come to cover a wealthy man hiding assets in a divorce. They had just listened to a confession to a murder conspiracy. The special agent was the first to break the silence. He slowly looked up from the laptop. "Do you have anything you'd like to share with the class regarding that audio file, Arthur?" Arthur stared blankly at the wall behind the judge. 5 seconds ticked by, then 10. Eleanor looked at the man she had married. For the first time in his entire life, Arthur Vance wasn't angry. He wasn't arrogant. He wasn't plotting his next move. He was completely, profoundly lost. His empire was burning to the ground faster than his brain could process the flames. That conversation is entirely out of context," Arthur finally stammered, his voice weak and hollow. The special agent let out a dry, rattling chuckle. "Funny how that works. Innocent people usually start by explaining what the conversation was actually about. Guilty people immediately complain about the context." Arthur closed his mouth. He had nothing left. The judge looked down at the federal files, then back up at the agent. "This Andrew," he mentioned. "Who is he?" "Andrew Lawson," the special agent replied, pulling a fresh file from his briefcase. "He was one of Mr. Vance's founding partners in the real estate firm." Eleanor watched the reporters in the back row frantically hammering the name into their phone browsers. "Officially," the agent continued, his voice echoing in the quiet room, "Mr. Lawson died in a tragic late-night hit-and-run accident." "Officially," the judge repeated, his tone heavy with implication. "Exactly." The agent closed the file with a loud snap. "But based on the audio we just heard, the Bureau now has probable cause to believe the circumstances of his death require a much deeper federal examination." The words hit the room like a wrecking ball. Eleanor felt the last remaining pieces of her old reality shatter into dust. She had known Arthur was a manipulator. She knew he was a liar and a thief. But a murderer? She looked at the hollow shell of the man sitting at the plaintiff's table and realized she hadn't just married a stranger. She had married a ghost. The judge closed his ledger. "Are there any further materials to present?" The special agent turned to Irene Sterling. The financial advisor suddenly stiffened, her eyes widening as if she had just remembered the final piece of the puzzle. The most important piece. "Actually, yes," Irene said, her voice cutting through the tension. "There is one more person." Arthur's head snapped up. The dead, hollow look in his eyes was instantly replaced by pure, uncut terror. The special agent caught the reaction. "Who?" Irene took a deep breath. "The man on the tape. The man who was with Arthur in the parking garage the night Andrew died." Arthur's heart stopped dead in his chest. That was impossible. It was absolutely mathematically impossible. That man had vanished off the face of the earth 8 months ago. No phone calls, no credit card activity, no trace. Arthur had assumed he was buried in a shallow grave somewhere in the desert. "And where is this man right now?" the agent asked. Irina didn't answer. She just looked at the judge, then at Eleanor, and finally she turned her head toward the heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom. Right on cue, the brass handles turned. The doors began to push open. Slowly. Agonizingly slowly, as if the universe itself was dragging out the final moments of Arthur's life. Every single head in the courtroom swiveled around. The bailiffs, the reporters, the special agent. Even the judge leaned out over the bench to see. A tall man in a dark weathered trench coat stepped into the aisle. Eleanor had never seen him before in her life. The special agent looked mildly surprised, but Arthur's reaction told the whole story. The moment their eyes locked, the last drop of blood vanished from Arthur's face. He looked like a man staring into the eyes of the Grim Reaper. The man walked slowly down the center aisle. He stopped at the wooden gate, looked at the man who had terrified him into exile, and spoke in a voice that carried to every corner of the room. "Hello, Arthur." The ghost took a deep breath. "I think it's time we told the judge what actually happened the night Andrew died." The silence that followed was absolute. The tall man pushed through the wooden gate and walked into the well of the court. His heavy footsteps echoed like the ticking of a doomsday clock. Arthur couldn't look away. He was staring at a dead man walking. "Please state your name for the record," the judge commanded gently. The man stopped, keeping his eyes locked on Arthur. "My name is Marcus Graves. I am a former acting partner in Mr. Vance's development firm." A frantic whisper swept through the gallery. The special agent pulled a fresh legal pad from his briefcase, his eyes shining with the thrill of the hunt. "Are you prepared to offer sworn testimony today?" the judge asked. "I am." Marcus finally looked away from Arthur and up at the bench. "For 8 months I've been running. I've lived out of motel rooms. I jumped at my own shadow. I tried to convince myself that the truth didn't matter, that nobody cared. But I'm done running. I am absolutely done being afraid of him." Eleanor felt her heart hammering against her ribs. She recognized the truth in the man's voice. He wasn't here for money. He wasn't here for revenge. He was just a deeply exhausted human being who couldn't carry the weight of a rotting secret anymore. Under oath, Marcus laid it all out. He walked the court through the labyrinth of financial crimes, the shell companies in the Caymans, the forged signatures, the millions of dollars evaporating into phantom accounts. But the financial crimes were just the appetizer. The main course came 10 minutes later. "The night Andrew died," Marcus said, his voice dropping an octave. "The 3 of us met in the underground garage of our downtown office. It got ugly fast. Andrew had a conscience attack. He told Arthur he was out. He said he had packed a box of ledgers and was taking them straight to the FBI the next morning." The courtroom was dead silent. Arthur lost his mind. Marcus continued staring at his hands. "I had known him for 10 years, and I had never seen him look like that. It wasn't just anger. It was predatory." They screamed at each other for 20 minutes. Finally, Andrew turned around and walked out of the garage. He was alive and perfectly healthy when he got in his car. The special agent's pen was flying across his legal pad. "And then what happened?" the agent prompted. 6 hours later, my phone rang, Marcus said, his voice cracking. It was the police. They told me Andrew's car had been T-boned by a stolen truck with no plates. They said he was dead on impact. The judge leaned forward, his eyes burning into the witness. "Why didn't you go to the police right then?" Marcus looked up, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "Because 2 days later, Arthur made it violently clear to me that if I ever opened my mouth, I would be the next one in the morgue." He didn't need to elaborate. The raw, unfiltered terror in his voice from the audio recording had already proven his point. The special agent closed his legal pad and stood up, buttoning his suit jacket. "Your Honor, based on the sworn testimony and the physical evidence presented here today, the Bureau will be opening a formal homicide investigation, effective immediately. alongside the pending federal indictments for wire fraud and extortion. Arthur sat perfectly still in his chair. He looked like a wax statue left out in the sun. The grand fortress he had spent a decade building had just been vaporized in less than an hour. The millions in offshore accounts couldn't save him. The expensive lawyers couldn't save him. His silver tongue was useless, because the truth has a funny way of working. It can be buried. It can be ignored for years. But eventually, it always digs its way out of the dark. The judge looked past the federal agent, past the lawyers, and locked eyes with his daughter. For the first time that day, the hard, unforgiving lines of his face softened into something warm. Eleanor. She looked up, wiping a stray tear from her cheek. Yes, Dad. It was the first time she had called him that out loud in almost a decade. The word hung in the air, sweet and heavy. The judge's eyes glistened. A tiny, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips. In that single, quiet moment, it became blindingly clear that despite the years of silence, despite the bitter arguments and the stubborn pride, the bond between them had never actually broken. Sometimes life burns your bridges to the ground, just to force you to build stronger ones. The judge brought his gavel down with a sharp, echoing crack. This court is in recess. Chaos erupted. The gallery exploded into a frenzy of shouting reporters scrambling for the doors to file their stories. The federal agents swarmed the plaintiff's table. The bailiffs moved in to secure the perimeter. Arthur Vance didn't fight back. He didn't scream. He didn't throw out empty threats about suing the government. He just stood up, slowly, his head bowed, finally feeling the crushing, unbearable weight of his own hubris. As the federal agent slapped the steel cuffs onto his wrists and turned him toward the side exit, Arthur suddenly stopped. He looked back over his shoulder, locking eyes with Eleanor one last time. For 3 seconds, the chaotic noise of the courtroom faded away. An entire decade flashed between them, the charming first dates, the beautiful wedding, the grand promises, and then the slow, suffocating descent into lies, manipulation, and cruelty. "Ellie," Arthur whispered, his voice barely carrying over the noise. She stood in silence. "I'm sorry." Nobody in the room knew if the apology was real. Maybe it was. Maybe it was just the desperate plea of a man who realized he was about to spend the rest of his life in a concrete box. But the beautiful truth was that it didn't matter. Eleanor didn't need his apology anymore. She didn't need his explanations, his closure, or his permission. True freedom begins the exact second you stop asking the person who broke you to put you back together. She looked at him. There was no hatred in her eyes, no burning desire for revenge, just a calm, quiet indifference. And that was her ultimate victory. She had walked through the fires of hell, and she had refused to let the flames turn her into a monster. She had kept her dignity. She had kept her soul. She had survived. The agents pulled Arthur through the heavy side doors. The wood clicked shut, and with that sound, an entire chapter of her life was permanently closed. Not her whole life, just the dark chapter. Because the rest of the book was just beginning. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Several months later, the federal indictments hit the news cycle like a hurricane. The shell companies were dismantled. The corrupt bankers were arrested. The truth behind Andrew's death finally saw the light of day in a federal court, and Arthur Vance was locked away in a place where his money couldn't buy him a damn thing. But for Eleanor, the front-page headlines and the sensational true crime podcasts didn't matter. The only thing that mattered happened on a quiet Tuesday evening, miles away from the city. Eleanor sat on the back porch of a beautiful, modest house in the suburbs. A pitcher of iced tea sweated on the wooden table. Sitting in the rocking chair next to her was her father. He was wearing an old flannel shirt, looking nothing like the terrifying magistrate in the black robe. They were talking. They were laughing. They were carefully stitching together the missing years, trading stories and building a future that just a year ago had seemed completely impossible. The sun began to dip below the tree line, painting the evening sky in deep, bruised shades of gold and purple. The crickets started to sing in the tall grass. The old man took a sip of his tea, leaned back in his rocker, and looked over at his daughter. "You know, Ellie," he said, his voice a low, comforting rumble. "I've spent a lot of time these last few months thinking about that day in court, thinking about who really won." Eleanor smiled, pulling a blanket over her legs. "And what's the verdict, Judge?" He looked out at the dying light of the sun. "The law didn't win. The feds didn't win. You won." She looked at him, genuinely surprised. "Why do you say that?" The old man turned to her, offering a warm, fiercely proud smile. "Because after everything that man put you through, after all the poison he poured into your life, you didn't let him make you cruel. And in this world, sweetheart, that is the rarest victory of all." Eleanor looked out at the golden horizon. For the first time in a decade, she didn't feel the frantic rush of adrenaline. She didn't feel the hollow ache of survival. She just felt peace. It was the deep, quiet peace that only arrives when the terrible storm finally breaks, when the monsters are locked outside the gates, when the truth is out in the open and the past is finally put to bed. It is the peace of knowing that no amount of money, power, or darkness can ever truly defeat a person who finds the courage to stand back up, step out of the shadows, and simply decide to live again. This profound story reminds us that no amount of wealth, power, or calculated manipulation can ever permanently suppress the enduring light of human dignity and truth. We often live in a world where arrogance behaves as though it is invincible, yet justice operates on a timeline that cannot be rushed, culminating in a poetic realignment of reality. What moves me most deeply is not the dramatic downfall of a corrupt man, but the quiet, unshakable resilience of a woman who refused to let cruelty hollow out her soul. It teaches us that true strength does not roar or strike back in anger. Instead, it stands firmly in its own truth, waiting for the dust of deception to settle. When we observe Elena, we witness the magnificent beauty of a spirit that remains soft yet unbreakable, proving that keeping one's humanity intact is the ultimate victory over abuse. Her journey shows us that liberation begins the exact moment we stop seeking validation or apologies from the very individuals who caused us pain. Furthermore, the reconciliation between the father and daughter highlights a beautiful truth. It is never too late to heal broken bonds, dismantle old pride, and rebuild the bridges of love. This narrative challenges each of us to look within and ask ourselves whether we are building our lives on transient illusions like control or on permanent foundations like integrity. Let this story be a gentle reminder to never mistake someone's silence for weakness, as the quietest souls often carry the heaviest truths and the deepest courage. In your own life, when faced with unfairness or trials, remember that your character is your ultimate shield, and preserving your kindness is a superpower. May you find the strength to rise above your past, break the invisible chains of fear, and step into a future anchored in peace and authentic freedom.